Welcome back. This is the introduction to part 4 of the course. So, congratulations, you're almost there. Part 4 is the shortest part of the course. It's with only 2 weeks and 2 lectures. Um, Even though the reading from the textbook is about the same as the others. But you're almost finished with the course. So, that is a positive. Take a deep breath and get yourself ready to end on a positive note, that last final push to the finish line, so to speak. This part of the course, there is some overlap with the previous part of the course. If you look at the list of the terms to know um, for exam 4, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, you'll see that there are a couple of them that were also on the list of terms to know for exam 3. That is by intent. And the reason for that is, let's say that the material covered in the textbook for this part of the course, in book 5 of the textbook, I've already covered in lectures in the last part of the course, dealing with Luther and Calvinism, particularly with the Reformation. I kind of dealt with that within one of the lectures uh, for the last part of the course. But since the textbook's reading for this part of the course also goes through that material, um, they're here too. Now, what does that mean for you? It means if one of those terms was um, on the exam 4, you would need to take into account the lectures from last part as well, because I don't talk about the Reformation in this course, with one exception, so to speak. The 2 lectures for part 4 cover the scientific revolution, or what's supposedly been referred to as the scientific revolution, and then human rights and the development in early modern Europe of human rights, and how that development and the emergence of the concept of human rights contributed in many ways to the transition from early modern Europe to what we then call modern Europe. So the lecture on human rights is also very much forward looking, but it gets at the origins. Now, in the lecture on the scientific revolution, I also go back and spend a fair amount of time in that lecture talking about medieval science, ancient and medieval science. And why I do so is because if we want to refer to something as a revolutionary change, we need to see what it changed from. And as I may have indicated, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, in the lectures on Christendom from part 3, the Middle Ages have been so misunderstood. And the caricatures coming from them, or caricatures about them, um, are not the historical reality whatsoever. And that particularly applies to medieval science in many ways. And so, I mean, I even saw something on Facebook. I think it's a meme, whatever. I'm not even sure what a meme is, but it came up on my Facebook feed. And I almost responded, but I thought, no, I'm not going to get into all of that. But it was a picture of like a medieval battlefield. And it said, somewhat paraphrasing, this is not memorizing it word for word, but pretty much. So there was a time when faith triumphed over science or ignored science. We've seen that before. And then you see the picture, and then below it was called the Dark Ages. Now, that was absolutely false in every way you can possibly imagine. Um, Faith did not triumph science at all. And I think I addressed that a bit in the lecture on Christendom, but I do so here because the scientific achievement of the Middle Ages was quite impressive and was necessary for the developments that scholars have referred to as the scientific revolution. And the concept of the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages being the Dark Ages, is absolutely a misunderstanding. We talk about the Greek Dark Ages, the time in archaic Greece before Homer, because we can't see into that period. The sources dry up all of a sudden. After the Mycenaean period, there's some archaeological sources and things, and it's like we can't see what happens between approximately 1200 BC and around 800 to 750 BC. We call it the Dark Ages because we can't see into it. Now, the Middle Ages were called the Dark Ages only beginning in the 19th century with Renaissance scholars who are trying to malign the medieval developments and refer to them as a long Middle Age and being dark. That is a complete misnomer, and the relationship between faith and reason, between science and theology, was far more complex than it is grossly and wrongly portrayed as. So that is something I try to address to an extent in this lecture on the scientific revolution, which deals primarily with figures such as Copernicus through Isaac Newton, essentially. And you will see why I talk in those terms. I hope understand why I went back and spent a fair amount of time talking about medieval science. Here, I certainly could have put that all in the Christendom lecture, but I thought that was a lecture that was already sufficiently long and didn't need added material. And so I would take care of that material here in terms of providing the context for the scientific revolution. So that is something that I hope you'll pay attention to see that the worlds were changing, and the whole concept of revolution. We find it first really with Copernicus and his De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, on the revolution of the heavenly bodies. That was his famous work published in 1543. And he's talking about then how the bodies move, the heavenly bodies move. That's where he argues for a heliocentric universe and all those things that we already know and talk about. And if you haven't learned that before, you'll be introduced to those concepts here. But then it starts being applied, the term revolution, to political developments, to social developments. And that is really what the question, the essay question for exam 4 is asking about. Is the term revolution one that adequately describes developments in Europe between 1500 and 1800, even within the world between 1500 and 1800, because these are developments both in terms of the scientific revolution and of human rights that are part of this so-called quote-unquote European expansion. If you think about it today, science is not simply a Western concept or practice or possession. The Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans are as involved in science and making developments in science as are Western Europeans or Americans. And so they became aspects of world history and central aspects of world history. If you want to think about technology today and include technology in terms of science, we live in a technological world that is developing on those levels. And where did that all begin? That's what this is looking at. And looking at the developments in quote-unquote science in the 17th century, and looking, of course, in the medieval origins there too, and how that then affected changing perspectives on the world, on reality, and approaching truth and knowledge that became then worldwide, basically. And the same with the issue of human rights. Human rights, as you'll see in the lecture on human rights, were really first put forward the idea of inherent human rights by John Locke, a British philosopher, mathematician, philosopher. And you will see that how that changed everything. Today, human rights are an international world order. And I talk about that as well in the lecture on human rights. I do talk about some of the later modern developments of human rights to see, this is the origins of the human rights discussions that go on today. It goes back to this original late 17th century treatise by John Locke, arguing for inherent human rights for individuals. And you'll see what he really meant by that. He certainly did not mean for all human beings, but you'll read about that in the lecture. So, but that provides then the basis. This kind of, let's say, science and human rights provides the basis for the modern world in this world system, whether we call it a world system, whether we call it, increasing globalization, but that the whole concept of the world is changed. It's not simply a particular individual perspective, whether it be the perspective of Native American cultures in the North American or South American continents, or whether it is the perspective of Chinese civilizations or Indian civilizations in Asia, but we have to see it all together. And some of those differences are still there, certainly. Culturally, intellectually, Eastern thought, Eastern philosophy is very different from Western philosophy, and yet science and human rights transcend all those individualities. And those all developed in this period. And that is in many ways where we end this course, with this transition from what scholars have referred to as early modern forms of intellectual and cultural life to modernity, which then becomes the touchstone for judging cultures, societies, etc., who are not modern. And what does that mean? And then, of course, these are questions for H109. And what comes after modernity? Are we still modern, or have we gone beyond the modern paradigm? And I suggest, I believe that in my view, we certainly have gone beyond the modern paradigm. We just don't have a good name for it yet. That's why it's being referred to often as postmodern. But that is a whole other issue. That's kind of the overview of what this part of the course is dealing with, why it's kind of the final piece in the puzzle for this course, Perspectives of the World to 1800 approximately. And I would again suggest that you take this time to, number one, first of all, look through the list of terms to know for part 4, and for the exam for part 4, look through the exam for part 4. And use that as your guide to doing the assigned reading in the textbook and for reading through the lectures. I also might suggest, okay, if you haven't already done this by now would be a good time to take a look at the final essay. Don't necessarily start worrying about it or spending too much time on it, but have it in your awareness, because it is an overarching question, and you can use that too for helping you organize your thoughts and organize this part of the course, the 2 lectures and the readings, of how does it all fit together. Because in some ways, the essay question on the exam 4 is very much focused on this part of the course, is dealing with revolutions, and I'll be addressing that preparing for the exam 4 talk. And then that is then in the overview of the whole thing, so to speak. If we want to look at the final essay, it's really dealing with, this is probably showing my age and everything else, the whole shebang, if that is still a term that is known, the whole deal. So that could be a help in terms of working through part 4 as well. So that's what I would say about this part 4. Again, I will be posting a talk on preparing for the exam itself. And so I'm not going to be doing that right here. If you have any questions, as I always say, please reach out. Ask if you have challenges, if you have worries, concerns, send me an email. We can set up a time to meet over Zoom, even in person, if that would be a better way to do it for you. And hopefully I can address those concerns and issues as we go through. So that being said, good luck with this last part of the course. You're almost there. I hope you enjoy it. I think this is a really exciting part of this entire course because it's the culmination. And I hope brings everything together. both with the textbook and with the lectures. So thank you so much, and I'll be back a couple more times. So enjoy part 4. Thank you.